Here's an outline of what we're going to be covering in this video. First, we're going to be looking at the UI of Blender, where things are laid out, how to customize it, workspaces, things of that nature. Then we're going to move into the 3D view and how to navigate using your 3-button mouse. Then how to move objects around inside of your 3D scene. Then we're going to discuss different work modes that you're going to be using inside of Blender. Then we'll get to Grease Pencil. We'll start by talking about strokes and just kind of lay out all the concepts related to them. And then we're going to progress to talk about animation, how you animate, first of all, objects in the scene so you understand the animation workflow in Blender, and then how to animate strokes in Grease Pencil. After that, I'm going to do a demo drawing a bouncing ball where I'm utilizing all the tools that we've discussed up to that point so you could see it all working towards doing a full animation. Then we throw some effects on the drawings, and then we are going to create a second scene so we can see how to compose multiple scenes in a single Blender file, bring them together in the video editor, and start working with multiple scenes so that we can do our final render from the same Blender file, and it will be our full animation cutting to the different scenes. So let's get started. So as soon as you open Blender, you're greeted by this splash screen. So depending on which version you have, it's going to be different. Um, Once you click anywhere off of the splash screen, it goes away, and then you're greeted by the default scene, which has this camera, cube, and light. So the first thing I want to talk about is just generally the layout. Assuming it's your first time you've opened Blender, it might be a little overwhelming to see all of these different options and menus and what's going on. So the first big concept is the view panels. So once you get more familiar with Blender, you're going to start noticing these boundary regions where you see the icon changes to this double arrow. And then what you're going to see is that you can change the size of these view panels. Well, another thing you can do is change what the view panel is looking at. So a view panel, you change its type right over here. So what type of view panel is it going to be? And you can make them, for example, all be 3D viewports if you so desired. And then you'll see that this is also a 3D viewport. Now this is a 3D viewport down here. So the point with this is to let you know that a view panel is just a general thing that can be of any of the many types. So when you open a Blender file at first, let's just go ahead and start a new file. I'm not going to save. So you're greeted by this default layout with the 3D view panel, the outliner, the properties, and the timeline. So another thing that's important about view panels is that you can customize them as much as you want. So one way to do that is when you have this double arrow icon while you're over some boundary, you can right click and then you can do, for example, a vertical split. And now you've just created a new view panel. You can also do a horizontal split. And the nice thing is that when you go into any area, you can basically split very generally. So let's drop one in here. Now let's say you've created too many of these view panels and you want to reduce the view panels. Well, actually before that, a cool trick to know is that when your mouse is over any one of the view panels, if you hit Control Space and Control Space, it's a toggle to maximize that particular view panel. So this will come in real handy when you're drawing because you immediately notice how it kind of gets rid of a lot of UI noise like that you might not be using at the moment, and it just maximizes what you're working with. So that's Control Space for that behavior. So now let's say we want to get rid of these. So you do the same thing. You look for the double arrow and then you right click and then you just say join areas. And it'll allow you to join areas if it's a feasible join, if it's possible to join. I'm going to hit escape to get out of here. So you'll see when I click here, I don't have the option to join areas because it wouldn't know how to join two view panels into one view panel, but it does know how to join one into one. So sometimes you'll see the join areas, sometimes you won't, and it's just a matter of whether or not it makes sense. So let's just get rid of some of these view panels. and then you just, once you've clicked, and then you just move your mouse over. So I recommend playing around with that. Just get comfortable with that idea, and then in general you'll be more comfortable with the UI. You'll be able to look at this and say, okay, these are just 4 view panels. One is showing the outliner, 3D view, timeline, and the properties, which I will explain these specific view panels in more details later on. Okay, so now that you know that, what a view panel is, how to create them, how to delete them, now you'll understand these tabs up here. These are just pre-configured view panels, and they're pre-configured for the particular workflow that you might be working in, whether you're sculpting, modeling, UV editing, what have you. I'm going to use my middle mouse button and the scroll wheel, and I'm going to scroll to show more tabs. So these tabs, again, are just pre-configured layouts. You could set this up by yourself by showing different parts of the menus, setting different types for the view panels, dragging and moving them, but these are just convenience, pre-packaged, pre-laid out things for common workflows that you're going to be working with inside of Blender. So that's what those are. Those are the view panels. The final trick, or not trick, but the final feature of the view panels is when you hover over a corner and you see a plus, you can also get the same behavior by clicking and dragging. I find it a lot easier to just hover and right click to do these things. But the one thing that you can't do with the hover and right click with the double arrow icon that you need from the corner is if you actually want to pop up a view panel, which is very helpful if you have dual monitors. So I can just, if I hold shift, then click and drag, now I've popped out this view panel, and I can pretty much customize it. I can, here I'll have to, since I don't have that split icon on this view panel, I'll have to use the technique of clicking here in the corner and dragging to create a new one. So basically you can set up, now I have this border. Now I can look at the double arrow and click, and then maybe do another, I didn't want to do that. I'm going to hit escape. I didn't want a vertical split. I want a horizontal split. And then maybe here I want the outliner, and here I want the properties for whatever reason. And then I can move this off to another view panel. The benefit of this is, of course, if you have dual monitors, you can basically have utilize your entire screen real estate. Like maybe you'll be just displaying the renders in one thing, or maybe just the shot camera, etc., etc. So that's the essence of view panels. I recommend play with that. And then the next part we're going to talk about is specifically this 3D view panel, its features, and what it does. So now we're going to talk about some features of the 3D view panel. Um, when you start Blender up, this is the default layouts. It has these 4 view panels: the outliner, properties, timeline, and the 3D view panel. So when you're working with the 3D view panel, obviously the most important thing is being able to navigate inside of your 3D scene. So your scene is effectively an infinitely large space. And you can put things into that infinitely large space. Of course, you're limited by your computer's memory, your ability to store values away from the origin, which is 0, 0, 0 in X, Y, and Z. So you can just put anything anywhere. Of course, there's hardware limitations, but just as a concept, it's an infinite world. As you can see, it stretches out to forever in all directions. And you could put objects in there, and the center of this world is called the origin, which is 0x, 0y, 0z. So the first thing you want to learn is how to navigate inside of this 3D scene. So it all revolves around the middle mouse button on a 3-button mouse. There are ways of setting it up for a 2-button mouse via your preferences, but I'm not going to cover that. You should have a 3-button mouse. It just makes your life a lot easier. So now that you have your 3-button mouse, what you can do is if you click and hold the middle mouse button, and sometimes it's a scroll wheel like it is for me. So I just click and hold it. Now I could tumble around the scene. This is called tumbling, where you're just kind of rotating around some arbitrary pivot in the scene. In this case, it's the origin, and the cube is at the origin. So the next thing you can do is if you hold shift, middle mouse button, click, and drag. So you're clicking and holding, and then you're dragging. This is called panning. So you're just basically moving side to side. Here's a cool thing about Blender. If you look at the arrow, the mouse icon, you'll notice that as it reaches the edge, it's not like it stops, but it comes back on the other side. So I can effectively keep scrolling in one direction for a long time. This is really cool, really useful, because let's say I needed to move a lot, it would, if it didn't have this behavior, I would actually have to let go and re-click again. And the same thing for going up or going down. Okay, so you just click, hold, and now you're panning. The next thing is control and then middle mouse button, click and hold, and then you're zooming. So you can zoom into towards an object. You can also do the zoom with the scroll wheel. Another way to do all this is with these helpful little icons here, but of course you have to then move your mouse off of what you're doing, come over here to activate them, well, to use them. So if I click and hold the zoom and drag, and then I can do the same thing. If I click and hold the pan, now I can pan around my scene. So I can either do it with middle mouse button shift and hold, middle mouse button control, or middle mouse button tumbling. There's no, I guess you could tumble this way using this 3D gizmo, which shows you your orientation. So this is telling you this is going forward in X, this is going forward in Y, this is going up in Z. So as you click and navigate around, you can see that. Now the number pad is really useful in the sense that you can get a perfectly like side view if you click on X. So now we're looking down the X axis. It's like shooting out through the screen into our brains. Or you can click Y to be looking down the Y axis. You could click Z, so you're effectively looking at it from the top now. Or you could click in here and just do like freely tumble around. Or you could click in here and do the same thing. So this helps you kind of get an orientation of the scene. A lot of these overlays and features you can enable or disable here. So if I don't want navigation, I can just turn these guys off, get myself a little bit more screen real estate, let's say, because I'm comfortable with the keyboard and using it for navigation. But in the meanwhile, if you need these, they're helpful. This other one here, what it does is it puts you into your camera view, which, as you can see, we do have a camera in the scene. There's a camera in our scene. This is what's actually going to render. What we're looking through right now is like a God camera. It's just there, but it really has no representation. It's just like, it allows you to view your world, but it's not a physical camera that you can select. It's called your view. So if you want to look through your camera, if you click this icon here, it puts you in that space. And the reason this is important, of course, this is what you're going to render. So this is effectively the areas that you're going to be outputting your renders to. So if I move my mouse and then it takes me out of the camera, so I can again click that icon to come in here or click and get out. I could also hit the number pad 0, which again is nice if you have your numpad in your keyboard, then you don't have to like move your mouse all the way here to click it. It's just a matter of like, let's say you're working and then you just hit 0 on your number pad and you can keep your mouse kind of in the area where it was. So that's hitting number pad 0. And an important thing you can do is if you hit the letter N, it opens these side panels here. A lot of viewports have tools that are activated by either N or T. So you see it's toggling my tools on the left side. So it's N and T. So if I hit N in the 3D viewport, what it shows me is the item, tool, and view. Again, view is like that God camera that you don't see view here. It's just a default way for you to look at your scene. That's not a camera that's been created. So you can't render from a view but it allows you to look and navigate around your scene. So if you wanted to, let's say I wanted to change the way I'm looking at this cube, I want to frame my shot differently, what I'm going to render. If I try to move now, then I have to do this. But let's say I want to actually move what the camera's looking at. Um, I could actually go into my camera view and then click lock camera to view. So now as I move around, you're going to notice that it doesn't kick me out of the camera. I'm moving the camera with me as I'm moving. So now I can reframe my shot, as it were. And then I can unclick that. And now it pops me back out of the camera. So this is pretty powerful. It allows you to set up, once I hit 0, it allows you to set up what you're going to render. Now for Grease Pencil, I understand it's 3D, but sometimes you are going to do camera movements. So these things are still relevant and important, because Grease Pencil is fundamentally just any other object inside of your 3D scene, which we'll of course get into the details. So that's how you would lock your camera view to this area, and that's the essence of navigation and looking around your scene. One more thing is, if you see this grid here, what that does is it changes from isometric to perspective, or orthographic to perspective. Yes, orthographic, it says it right there, to perspective. So you can see perspective, it has vanishing points. So everything is kind of going towards a vanishing point. Orthographic does not. All the lines are parallel to one another along the axes. So you've seen some games that use this type of orthographic view, or you can do that. You can also hit the number pad 5 to switch between the different modes. And the number pad here comes in use again because if you press, let's say, the number 1, it takes you to the front. Now you're looking down the y-axis. 3, you're looking at the side. You're looking down the x. 7, you're looking at the top. And then 9, I guess you're looking at the bottom now. Of course, when you're in one of these views, you can get out of it just by click and dragging your middle mouse button again. So you want to get really comfortable with navigating around your scene. And in order to do that, the other thing is being able to select an object. So you can click select the object. That's a left click to select the object. And what you could do is you could hit number pad, the dot on the number pad, and it'll zoom you into your object and make your camera kind of tumble around the object that you've selected. So let's say, for example, so that makes sense, like I have my camera selected now, but if I tumble, it's still around this cube and at the origin, and it's not tumbling around my camera. So I can hit the dot, and now I'm going to be tumbling around my camera. Same thing with the light. If I select the light and I hit the dot in my number pad, now I'm tumbling around the light. So this comes in handy when you want to focus in on some work you're doing and keep your camera relevant to that work. That's about it for navigation. So I definitely suggest practicing those things so that you can, quickly get into something and feel comfortable with just moving around and selecting things and getting to see what you're doing. And just keep in mind, this is an infinite space that you're placing objects in. So next up, we'll be talking about the different tools and how to move these objects around and where that information is. So now we're going to look at moving objects in the 3D space. So as we said before, again, your space is a theoretically infinite scene that goes on to infinity in all directions. But now you have objects in it, and the center of your scene is the origin, meaning it's 0, 0, 0. So let's look at where this information is, because fundamentally it's all numbers. How far along are you on the X? How far along are you on the Y? How far are you along the Z axis? So if you hit the N key and you see this item, it'll show you the location, rotation, and scale of the currently selected item. So if I select the light, you'll see now I have more information because I'm away from the origin. Or if I select the camera, this is basically telling me how far away from the origin I am. So it's negative y in this direction. It's positive x, meaning it went positive in this direction. And you could see that the negative y goes this way. So that's why it's negative y 6 and positive 7 in x. And then it moves up, so it's positive z about 5 meters. So just to drive the point home, let's select this object. It happens to be our default cube. And now I can click and drag along the x-axis. And this is going to determine where it's going to be along the x-axis. So I'm going to control Z that. Now here I can click and drag for the Y, control Z, and then click and drag for the Z, control Z. So here is all the information. Now, the way you're going to normally move objects is not going to be by clicking and dragging here unless you really need precision. Like if I just click once and I say I really want it to be 0.5 meters in the X, and then we'll see it's just slightly moved along the X. So if you want precision, you'll type here, or if it's going to be explicitly along an axis, you can use these fields here. You can also rotate along the different axes and scale along the different axes. But the real way you're going to be working with things primarily is while you're in your 3D view, you're going to be grabbing it with the letter G and drag. Sorry, not drag. You just left click, select the object, hit the letter G, and you're not pressing anything. And then all you do is move your mouse, and it's going to move along there as you want it. And then when you click, when you left click, it leaves it there. So we're going to do that again. We're going to grab it with G. We're going to move our mouse. Now you can also restrict this movement to axes once you're moving the object already. Now if you hit the letter X, it'll restrict the movement to X. If you hit Y, it restricts it to Y. If you hit Z, it restricts the movement to the Z axis. The next one is, of course, you might want to rotate it. So you hit R and it's going to rotate. When you rotate, I'm going to hit escape to get out of here without actually changing it. When you rotate, if you're too close, it's a little uncomfortable because it just rotates so fast. So you want to be a little bit of distance away. So when you hit R, it's going to you can control the rotation a little bit better. And of course, you can also constrain it to the axes X, Y, and Z. Then when you click, that's where it is. Next up, you can scale. So again, you want to be a little bit away because it's based on how far you move from the origin. So if you're right here, any movement, it's just gonna scale very fast. So I'm gonna hit escape. I want to be out here. Now I'm gonna hit S, and now I can. It's a little easier to control the scaling. Then I just click to get out of it. Of course, I can constrain it before I click to X. Now we have some shearing because it's not exactly perfectly aligned to axes. I could do it along the Y and I could do along the Z. So let's just click and there we have it. So I'm gonna G to grab and move, and that's how you move the objects. And this is where you see the information of what you've changed. So here I can unrotate it by hitting 0. I could set the scale back to be uniform, so it's 111. And then I can put it back at the origin of the scene by, so what I did here was I clicked and dragged to select the 3 fields, and then I hit 0, so now I'm updating the 3 fields, and it puts me back at the origin of the scene. So that means I'm at the very center of the scene. So that's how you move, scale, rotate objects, and how you use this item properties here. You also notice if you have your property view panel, when you have the object selected, you have the same capabilities here as you do through here. So if you hit the letter N, that goes away. You can use the properties here if you want to. So if I G grab, move, R rotate, S scale, I have values throughout here. I can click and drag, make these 0. Click and drag, make these 0. Click and drag and make this 1. So what you see here is going to be the same. It's going to be based on what you have selected. And that's how you place objects in your infinite 3D scene. Every value of where it is along an axis is basically a distance from the origin point. Up next, we're going to talk about different modes that you'll be working with inside of this 3D view space. And now, of course, this is still relevant to 2D grease pencil because fundamentally, as we'll see soon, the grease pencil drawings that you're going to be doing are still 3D objects inside of the scene. It's just that we're looking at a camera down one side, so that we're looking at it straight down one axis. So it's going to look flat, but it's still going to be three-dimensional. And you could use that to your advantage by, doing overlapping shapes, introducing 3D objects to your 2D animations, things of that nature. So it's really powerful once you're comfortable with navigating and moving objects in your scene. And up next, we're going to be talking about the different modes that you can work in with Blender. All right. So now you've had a brief introduction to the UI, you understand the view panels, how to change their type, how to create them. You've also understand how to do navigation inside of the 3D viewport, and also how to move objects inside of your 3D scene. So now we're going to look at the next layer of manipulation of data or information, which is going to be the modes. So they're broadly speaking two modes you're going to be thinking about. One of them is the fairly straightforward one, which is your shading mode, which is how this viewport displays to you as a user. So you could say, show me what it would look like if I were to have rendered by clicking this button here, or don't do the rendering because right now it's very easy because it's just a cube, so it's pretty instantaneous. Also, I'm in Eevee, which you can see which renderer you are here in the which renderer you're in here in the properties. So here I'm using Eevee. I could switch to cycles, and then you'll see that it's, as I move around, it's actually rendering. It looks fuzzy for a moment as it calculates what it looks like. It's pretty fast and responsive because it's just a cube. As soon as your scene gets more complex, it's more intense. Eevee itself is a real-time render engine, kind of like a Unity or Unreal or Godot. So it's, I guess, more efficient in its calculations. It also has a few more limitations. It doesn't do the ray tracing and depth and like subsurface scattering to depth and all that as you can with cycles. But just the fact that it's so fast is pretty good. But anyway, this render mode here is telling you, show me what it would look like if it's rendered. And then, of course, it's going to depend on what type of renderer you're using. Next up is material preview mode. And if I had textures on this cube, now I would still be able to see the texture on the cube, but I wouldn't have all the lighting, ray tracing, etc. So I wouldn't see a full render. I would just see kind of what's the surface, what are the surface colors on this thing based on my texture. And then finally, the most common mode, because it's faster, it's easier to display, is the solid shading. And actually, finally, the fastest and easiest is the wireframe, where you're just seeing an outline of the geometry that you're working with. You're just seeing the edges. So the more common is solid mode. So that's it for modes. There's more information you could get into, particularly if you're sculpting. You might want to check out MatCap and what all these different things are about. But for grease pencil, as far as I know, and it this really isn't going to be that useful. So you could, of course, look at the manual for more information about that. I don't want to make this video longer than it already is. So those are your shading modes, how you're going to preview things here in the 3D view panel. And of course, it depends on your renderer when you select the render mode. All right, so we're back in solid shading mode. Now, the next type of mode that's important is your work mode. What type of work are you doing on an object? So remember when we move an object, rotate or scale, it's so any movement is relative to the origin. So if I hit G and I move it, it's just telling me values along X, along the Y, and along the Z of how far away I am from the origin. I can click here in my properties to see that. So I'm minus almost 8 in X, 0.33 approximately up in the Y, or sorry, forward in the Y, I should say. Nope. Yes, I'm just slightly forward. So this is the positive Y, has the actual letter. The negative would have this one. And I'm up approximately 4 in the Z axis. So that's what this information is saying. So let's set it back to 0. I clicked and dragged to select the 3, and then I hit enter, or 0 and enter, put it back at the origin. So now we want to work, obviously, what we see in 3D are like just these amazing, characters and scenes and all this stuff. So it's not just built with cubes. They're obviously manipulating the geometry at some point. And the way that comes into play is you switch your mode. So we're going to change from object mode to edit mode. So once we're in edit mode, we're able to actually manipulate the vertices. So I can select the vertex. Now I can grab a vertex and move the vertex. Edges. So I can grab an edge, of course, move an edge, rotate an edge, scale an edge, and faces. So now I can grab faces. I can grab, rotate, scale. So this isn't a 3D modeling video, so I'm not going to get into all these tools because you'll notice that when I changed mode, my tools also changed. I'm going to drag this out just so I can see the names. And you can scroll here with your mouse button. So here you have all these different tools you can use for modeling. But we're not going to get into modeling, but the reason why I'm giving this example of the different modes with the cube is because a stroke, which is what you're going to be using to draw for grease pencil, is an object in your scene, and then you go into edit mode to do certain manipulations, and then it has more modes that you can do. So for example, this a geometry, it has multiple modes. It also has sculpt, vertex, weight, paint, and texture modes, texture paint modes. So if I hit tab, it's a toggle between object and edit mode. So here's an illustration I made to kind of help you see this information. It's also going to talk a little bit about the outliner and the properties panel. So again, in object mode, that's really where you just grab, rotate, and scale an object. And as we saw, translation is your distance away from the origin. Rotation is kind of relative to the origin of the object itself, and then of course scale. So these are the object mode icons. So the orange ones here, and they're also the orange ones here in your properties. And of course, this is relevant to what you have selected. In edit mode, this should probably be one word here, but when in edit mode for a camera, you'll be able to work on focal length, clipping planes, near far, and that type of stuff. So it's relevant to what you have selected. For geometry, you'll be able to work with vertices, edges, faces, UVs, normals, etc. For lights, you'll be able to work with intensity, color, radius, and other attributes that are specific to a light. And then for a stroke, which is what grease pencil, its fundamental object, its data, you'll be able to work with materials, layers, blend mode, and opacity. And all that's going to be here in your properties. So these menus change based on what you have selected. These menus do not change. Like, for example, this is where we were defining our renderer. So that doesn't change depending on whether you have a cube, a camera, a stroke, or a light selected. These are consistent. They're attributes of the scene, properties of the scene, let's say. And these are the properties of the current selection. So they change around. So let's look at that. Let's go back into Blender. So now I'm gonna, if you don't see all the menus or you see some kind of clipping here, you can use your scroll wheel to scroll the menu, just like we did with the tabs up here. So if I scroll this here, I can see all the menus here. Now keep your eye on this area as I change my selection. Now I'm going to select the camera. You're going to notice that these did not change, but these did change. I mean, there's still the object that's consistent throughout. If you're in the 3D scene, you're an object, and you're always going to have that orange tab. But the rest of the tabs change based on what you have selected. So if you have a light, you'll see you have properties for the light. If you have a camera, you'll see you have properties for the camera. If you have an object selected, you have properties for a geometry, vertex group, shapes key, UV maps, vertex colors, normals, etc. All that type of stuff. And materials, modifiers, particles. So all of that, all of these tabs here are based on what you have selected. So hopefully that demystifies a good chunk of what this menu does. It doesn't tell you explicitly in detail what every single tab does. We will get into details when we talk about Grease Pencil, but I think it's important just to know what it means, why they change, and what they represent. So fundamentally what they represent is unique data to a particular object. So back to this image here. So we have object mode, which is moving the thing around inside of the scene. We have edit mode, which is properties of the particular object that we have selected. But then, for example, in some cases we have more modes. So here, when we have a grease pencil stroke, on the layers, we can have draw mode, sculpt mode, vertex paint mode, and weight paint mode. And you can work with the layers here in the outliner, but you can also, you'll primarily be working with them here in the properties view and the dope sheet, which we'll talk about later once we get into actually drawing and doing stuff, which is coming up. So bear with me. So hopefully that demystifies the properties panel and the outliner, so you get a sense of what's what. So now that you're a little bit more oriented in where the information is, let's actually go ahead and add a stroke and start explaining its properties. So when you're going to add an object, you have this like red and white circle thing. That's the 3D cursor, and that's where things are going to happen. You could move the 3D cursor around. I usually move it around by mistake. Right now I can't remember. Oh, so I have to click cursor here, and I can move my cursor. And then if I say Shift C, I believe, yes, it centers the cursor and centers my view. The reason, again, why this 3D cursor is important is because that's where things are going to be placed, and sometimes you can do things relative to that 3D cursor. So now I'm going to, you can add something to the scene by either clicking add or by doing Shift A. So I'm going to add a grease pencil stroke. Now I could add a blank, but that means that I have to build things up from scratch. I have to create my own layers, create my own materials. If I create a stroke, it's going to have a couple layers already pre-made and a couple materials pre-made. Let me just show you. Let me make a blank one. Then I'm going to grab it, move it along the X over here. And that's just this orange dot, which represents the origin of that object, but there's nothing to it. I'm going to do Shift A again. I'm going to add another grease pencil. I'm going to add a stroke. And then I'm going to grab and move it along the X this way. So this was the blank we added. Let me just move it down here if I can. Can I move it down there? Oh, popped it out. All right. I don't think I can reorder it this way. Anyway, my point is, so I'm going to minimize this here. And if I expand this grease pencil, it only has basically object and edit mode. It doesn't have any more information. But when I added a stroke, it's still a grease pencil object. You can change the name of this to whatever you want. But you can see by the icon, it's the same type of object. And it also has the same type of edit mode because you can see by that kind of curve, which represents a stroke. But when you add a stroke, it also has two layers that are added to it. And then if you look at that in the properties, so now we have two layers. And whereas if I were to select my grease pencil stroke here, I don't have any layers, but I could add layers if I want to, so I could do it. This is just, adding a stroke is just a convenience that pre-populates things. The other thing it pre-populates are materials for being able to draw. So if I just added a blank, see I have no materials, and that's basically going to be your inks, like which colors you're going to be working with when you draw. We'll get into all of that in detail when I get into the demo of doing the bouncing ball, but for now, let's just stay a little high level regarding the concepts. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy. I'm just going to hit delete. So I selected it, I hit delete. So now looking at the stroke, let's talk about the modes that we get into with grease pencil. So again, the modes are still driven here. I'm going to actually hit, well, no, I'm going to leave the tools. I was going to hit T to toggle the tools away, but I'm going to leave them so we can see how they change based on your mode. So now I have the stroke selected. I'm clearly in object mode, which is the orange icon, top level, placement in the world of all the data that's represented by this object here, all of its layers. So now I could hit tab, go into edit mode, and now I'm going to be working at this level of data, and then you'll see that my tools changed. So now I can extrude, I can change the radius, I can blend, shear, transform, fill. But the mode that we really want to play with is draw. So once I'm in draw mode, I can select a pen, and then again, all of my tools change. I could select a different type of brush here. And we're going to get into all the details here later on regarding all these different options. Right now, we're just focusing on the concept of modes, of like which work mode you're in, what type of data are you manipulating. So now I'm in pen mode and I can draw, but you'll see that it's kind of on a weird plane. And as I draw there, it's also on a weird plane. So we'll figure out how to control what plane our drawings are going to be on once we get into that. But basically what I've just created more data, more points and strokes through the points that I can later manipulate, change the color, all that stuff. But I put all of these points, if you can imagine, each drawing is like I'm adding up point inside of this layer. So if I go to my layers back here, here I'm looking at my edit mode stuff. I can see I'm working in my lines layers. It's just what I happen to have selected when I went into draw mode. And I can hide it and it all goes away. or bring it back. I can lock a layer, all that stuff. So that's draw mode. There's also sculpt mode, and you're going to see my tools are going to change again. So I go to sculpt mode. So now I have different tools. I can like grab parts of my line and move it around. I can smooth it out, etc. So this is yet a different mode, but it's still working on the points that I made. And the reason why I say point is because a stroke is fundamentally a whole bunch of vertices, and depending on the material it has, it determines how it's drawn, what the quality of the line is. So if I were to go back to edit mode, and then I can see that I can select the points that make up the line. Or I could select this other stroke or this stroke here, but the reason I can go back and forth amongst them is because they're all on the same layer. So that's edit mode. Sculpt mode, you saw I had actual brushes I can use to manipulate the stroke. Draw mode, now I can use my pens and my fills, change my pen type to be able to draw differently, different strokes. It's still a series of points, it's just that the quality in which they're rendered changes based on the material and the type of pen properties that I use to draw it. So if I go to edit mode, you'll see again, they're just points. They're all just points. They're just rendered based on the quote unquote ink or material that I chose while I made the stroke. So uh that's all there is to grease pencil. So we're kind of like peeling different layers of the onion back, right? So first it's like we've got this infinite scene. We're putting objects in the scene. We're navigating in our scene. We're we're setting different shading modes in our scene based on our needs. We're placing new objects in our scene, like we created a stroke, and then we're working in different modes of with the data. So that actually becomes very easy to understand after you've run through it like a couple times. And it's like, okay, which mode I'm in, my tool set changes, what I'm actually doing changes. Do I want to work on a stroke on a point by point basis? Like I really want that fine level of control, or do I want to create new strokes by drawing, or do I want to manipulate them broadly with the sculpt tool? So it gets easier. It might seem like a lot at first, but again, we've just reviewed a lot of basic concepts, and once you work with it a few times, it'll become more and more clear. So, so that's it for modes and explaining what the different modes mean. Again, one more quick peek at this. Oh no, I closed the image. But anyway, I think you get the concept. So now when we're back here in object mode, now I can actually move the whole object. So if I hit grab, if you can imagine, I'm moving this origin, which is the dot, and inside of this object is all of this layer information. So I could basically have a drawing and really place it in the 3D scene wherever I need to place it now when I'm in object mode. I could also animate in object mode. Um, and I can also animate my drawing independently, so I can have a drawing that's animated and then also animate its placement in the scene. And I will show you exactly how to do that once we get into the demo. So up next, let's take a slightly closer look at strokes. So let me go ahead and just restart the scene. I'm not going to save anything. And up next, we're going to be looking at the how you would actually go about using grease pencil in Blender. All right, so now we're getting closer and closer to the demonstration, but first I'm going to give some details and concepts regarding drawing with grease pencil. So first of all, when you start Blender and you're in the splash screen, you could, instead of starting with this general 3D scene, you could start with this 2D animation template. So let's do that. You could also do that when you go here to the new menu, 2D animation. What it does is it exposes the common tools that are used, and it presets the view panels for Grease Pencil. So it has an outliner here showing you what's in your scene. It has the tool properties here uh, based on what you have selected. So here's, I can see the strokes. Um, and then it has this dope sheet over here for animation, which I'm not going to talk about just yet. But what I do want to show you is address the first kind of elephant in the room, which is it was a point of confusion for me, where wait a minute, so I'm in a 3D viewport, but this is like a 2D canvas. How is this represented in the scene? It feels a little weird. But do not fear, if you just middle mouse click and tumble around, you'll see that this is indeed still a 3D scene. What the template that was created using the 2D animation setup is it created a camera that's looking straight down the Y axis, so that you're drawing in the X and Z axis, which is the setup that it has here, so that your strokes will land on the X and Z plane. So if I hit 0, go back into the scene, and then I'm just going to quickly make a stroke, and I am using a tablet. So if I middle mouse button and tumble again, I see that my stroke is actually an object in a 3D scene. And just like any other object, if I get out of draw mode and I go into object mode, I can G grab and move it around. Or I can R, let's grab it again, click R and rotate it, or S and scale it. So I'm just going to bring the origin back to the origin. So it's still 3D, it's still a 3D scene, and this is actually how you can like put 3D objects and have 2D drawings working together. It's just Blender's 3D with Grease Pencil, which gives it 2D capabilities that can be placed in the 3D scene. So the first concepts we're going to look at, I'm going to go back to 0 to look through my camera, um, is that a stroke has 3 modes that you're going to be working with. Those 3 modes are primarily, well, 4 modes, let's say: object, edit, sculpt, and draw. If you get more advanced and you build armatures, and then you'll be working with weight painting. You could also do vertex paint to do your color work differently. But I'm just going to be going over these 4 modes. Object, as I've shown you, is your ability to work at object level and move it and place it around in the scene. So those are the orange icons representing the object level. So your translation, rotation, scale. Next up is your edit mode. In your edit mode, you're able to select your 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 strokes, and then you can grab them and move them, and you'll notice that the origin isn't moving. So that means I'm not moving the entire stroke object. I'm just moving a particular stroke, which isn't too obvious. So I'll make a few strokes so that it can differentiate better. You can see the difference. So that's edit mode. Sculpt mode allows you to change an existing uh, stroke. So now I can hold shift and smooth that out. I'm going to widen this area here just to see the tool names. So if I hit grab, an important key is F to increase the radius of the tool, shift F to work with the strength, where 1 is maximum strength. So now it's moving it a lot. If I hold shift F again and I reduce the strength, you can see it's not working as strong. So if you want to do something subtle and not really change the line, you can play with the strength and radius. So I'm just going to hold shift and smooth. All right, so that's the sculpt mode, is the ability to change with using these different tools. You can also vary the thickness of the line in a particular section of the stroke if you want. And then finally, the draw mode. This is where we're creating strokes. So let me go ahead and make another stroke here and another stroke here. And just to hammer the point home, they're in the 3D scene. So I'm going to hit 0, get back into the camera. All right. So now let's slow down and look at draw mode a little bit more closely. So for draw mode, there are three things that are very important. Number one is selecting which brush you're using. And a brush is really just a set of properties that determine the quality of the line. So if I were to select ink, you'll see that my line is like this. If I were to select this guy here, and then my line changes, it gets thick and thin more. You get the idea. So you can make custom brushes just like Photoshop, but we're not going to get into all that right now. So that's the first thing. You want to select the brush. Second thing, you want to make sure you're working on the layer that you're intending to work on. So if you want to be working in the line layer, this is where you select your layer. And you'll see which layer you're on in these three places. You'll see it in the, you can select it and see it in the outliner, or select and see it here in the properties for the stroke. You could also select it here in this dope sheet. So the dope sheet is for animation, and I will address this, but we'll talk about that later. First, I want to focus on strokes. So what I'm going to do is just hide it for now. All right, so you've picked your pen type, you've picked the layer you want to work on. Now it's the third part. What's the ink you're going to use? So these are default inks that were created by the program when you went in, when you created the 2D animation template. The inks have different types. You can make a new ink if you want. So let's go ahead and make a purple one. I'm going to create a new material here, and I'm going to rename it to whatever I need. And this is usually what you do is basically set up your palette, the inks that you're going to be using. Now an ink can be a stroke. So let's look at that. I'm going to middle mouse button to scroll this menu so I can see everything. Let's make it purple. So I'm just going to make it purple. Okay. And then I'm going to draw a shape there. So you can play with different properties for the stroke. You can also set it to have fill so that it fills itself, and look at the properties of fill. You can change its color as well. So there you can have stroke fill, you could have just a stroke, or you could have just a fill. Fill can also change its type to be, for example, gradient. And you can also change it to be a texture where you would have to go find the texture file that you want to use to fill in the area that's covered by that fill. So again, this is how you customize your ink. Of course, you can delete things that you're not using, but this is the third component for when you're drawing. So again, the first one is pick your brush. Second one, make sure you're in the right layer. Third one, pick the ink you want to be using. So that's drawing. That's how we create things. And let's say we want to fill a shape after the fact, and maybe I want to work in a separate layer. So let's look at layers again. Layers, of course, you can create, rename, do whatever you want. You can create as many new layers as you want. You can reorder layers, and then each layer can have an independent blend mode and opacity. So each one will have their own setting for that. You could, of course, delete layers. So it's really flexible and important for controlling what you're drawing. So let's say I want to fill the shape now. I would select the fill tool, and then I would make sure I'm in the right layer, of course, and then I would pick a fill ink. So something that has a fill property set. So if I look at here, I see that the fill property is set. So when I click, it fills the shape. So that's how you would use the fill tool. I'll show more when we get into the demo. So that's the draw mode. Now let's look at sculpt mode. Again, if we hit F, I'm just going to increase the radius, and now I can move. So here it just moved the fill because of the layer I'm in. So I can come back to lines and move. Oh, my strength is down, so I'm going to hold Shift F. No, my strength is up. Oh, I was in thickness. I thought I was in grab tool. So if I grab, yeah, see. So now I can change the shape of my drawing. I can smooth it out a little bit, etc. So that's in general sculpt mode. And then finally edit mode, I can click select a particular stroke, move it. I can move it, I can rotate it, I can scale the stroke. So that's what I can generally do in edit mode. So those are the four modes that you're going to be working with when you're working with strokes. Again, when you're working with drawing, you want to pick your brush, pick your layer, and then pick your color. And we'll be going over this more extensively once we do the practical demo, and I'll be talking through all the things I'm doing as I'm doing them. So let's talk about animation. So there are three ways to do, well, there's more than three ways. There's like particle effects, physics, things like that. But generally, when you think about objects moving in a 3D scene, there's generally three ways to look at them. So the first way, of course, is just the object. So you see everything that is inside of a scene is effectively an object. So the first way is, let's say you have a model and you've built an armature and then you animate the armature. So what you can do is you go into a special mode for armatures for animation that's called pose mode, and you go ahead and animate the armature, which is bound to the geometry. So the geometry now moves, all the vertices move based on how you're manipulating that armature. So we're not going to get into that in this video. The next thing, of course, is just moving an object, which is actually true for these three types here that I'm talking about. So this is just like a plane geometry. It doesn't have an armature. That means you can't animate the vertices or edges or anything like that. You can't really move it. But you can't move the components of it, vertices, edges, faces, but you can move the whole object. So you can move the square or the box around. Um, and then next, this is what we're going to be looking at, which is how conceptually how Grease Pencil is set up. So you can imagine, let's say this is frame 1, frame 5, and frame 10, let's say. So we know that it's an object in the scene that we can animate broadly, but then we're going to be doing drawings. So how are these drawings organized? Well, they're organized inside of frames. So when you're in frame 1 and you draw, and then you can move the time slider to frame 5, make a new drawing, move the time slider to frame 10 and make a new drawing. So this is how your animation is going to work, and then when you play it back, you have this sensation that this little ball is moving up on the screen. So let's look at object level animation first. So let's get out of our scene here, and I'm going to just go ahead and hide this stroke object that I made for that illustration. And then I'm going to do a Shift A, and I'm going to add a cube. So now let's just go ahead and focus on animating at the object level. And again, this is relevant because, I'll go ahead and do it right now. Let's add a stroke right now. And then I'm going to G to grab, move it along the X just so you can see it. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my world properties, just darken the color, just a smidge. And so now let's look at how we're going to animate these things. So we can see that this is an object and this is an object. It's represented as things in our scene. We already know that we can look at their location, rotation, and scale information here, hitting the N key as a toggle, or using this little arrow here. We could also see that object information of our current selection here. So if I G grab the cube and move it, I see that information here. Now if I grab this stroke, it's just showing me that I've moved it along the X 3.9252 meters. So now let's talk about animation. So animation is about basically recording this information of the object in the scene over a sequence of frames. So the first thing we want to do is have this viewport set up to be the dope sheet, which it already is, and the dope sheet has subtypes. Dope sheet is going to be what you use for object level animation. Um, and then grease pencil is what we're going to use when we are animating the strokes inside of the frames. And I'll give you an example of that, of course. So let's go back to dope sheet. We are looking at our object. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit the letter I, and I'm going to set a key on the location. That basically means record all the current information about where I am, the location, and associate it to frame one in the timeline. So again, I'm going to hit the letter I, and then I can hit the letter L. So now I've created a keyframe, and it shows me the information. Now I can go over to a new frame, so move forward in time. I'll hit G to grab the cube, and let's just move it here. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to hit I again. So notice that it was not automatically created. Sometimes you want that behavior, and you could turn that on here with auto keying. So once something has a keyframe and you're in a new frame and you move it, it'll just record it. But for now, let's just do it um, the I guess the main way. So we'll hit I, and we can click location. So now we've set two keyframes, and the cube is going to move across these two keyframes. So if we hit play, it just goes through the timeline, and that's how you animate. Of course, we can animate rotation, we can animate scale at the object level as well. So of course, we can do the same thing with our stroke. So I'm going to grab the stroke, I'm going to hit the letter I, location, and I've just created a keyframe that's basically taking a snapshot of where I am in time and associating it to this key. So we'll go forward in time, and then I'm going to hit G to grab the stroke and just move it, and hit I, location. So now when I hit play, you see that everything is just moving based on how I did it. So that's the basics of animation. It's just setting keys and having the object move from one position to another. With an armature and a character, of course, it's more complex. Or with grease pencil, if you're drawing a character, it's going to be a little more complex. So let's get into how we can animate with grease pencil. So I'm just going to do it a little quick and explain what's happening. So first of all, let me get rid of the animation we did here. Otherwise, it's going to be tough to draw on it while we're talking. So let me look back through the camera. I'm going to go to 0. I'm going to hit G to grab my object, move it in X by hitting the letter X. And then I am going to go into draw mode. So I have the ink pen selected. That'll work fine. Let me see which color I'm using. I'm using the black color. Okay, that'll work. And then finally, what layer am I in? I'm in the layer lines. Okay, and you'll see that we have this new icon here showing that, hey, you've got animation on this object. Um, Although we deleted the key that it's moving towards, it still has one key here. So that's where this information is stored for the object. So now I've got my layer selected, I've got my color selected, my ink, and then I have my brush selected. So let's just do a quick drawing. So first of all, since we're working inside of frames for grease pencil, we need to go into grease pencil mode of the dope sheet. So we could come over to the, oh right, so this moved back because when I grabbed it and moved it, I didn't update the information. So let me go back and do that. So let's go back to frame 1. Let me get out of draw mode. Let me hit grab X, move it here, And then I'm going to hit I again to insert the key location. So now it's updated. So now when I move it, it stays there. All right, so let's go back into grease pencil mode. I'm going to hit Control Tab so that I see all my modes. It's a little easier, so I don't have to, and I could hit Escape to get out of there. That way I don't have to keep moving my mouse to come up here. So I'll just Control Tab and go into draw mode. So now what I am going to do is I'm just going to draw something right here. So now, as is shown in the example, we are in frame 1 and we've drawn something. So it's basically stored this information. Well, I guess in this case it's showing the squiggly as well, but it's associating it to a frame, the drawn stroke. So we're associating it to frame 1. We're on the lines layer. So now we move over. Once I start drawing, these things are going to disappear. I'll show you what I mean. Because I'm creating a brand new frame. That frame is empty by default, and I just populated it with this object. So what happens is Grease Pencil holds the information of this frame up until it meets a new frame in the timeline, and then it shows that. So then we're going to go over to one more frame, and then we can see that we have this animation happening. So that's the basics of animating with the animating a stroke or animating a drawing inside of Grease Pencil. So it's nothing too crazy. What could be a little annoying is the fact that it disappears each time. So when I go to draw something new, I can't really see where it is or where it came from. So that's where ghosting comes in. So ghosting, so if I'm in this middle frame, it's going to show me the information of the frame before the current frame, and after, so that I can better, adjust my timing, or, make sure that it looks similar enough so that it's like the same ball. So it helps me plan out my animation. And that's basically it. That's really all there is to doing the animation. Now the trick, of course, is doing interesting drawings and you know using fills, making it pretty if that's the route you want to go as well. Um, so just super fast recap. Dope Sheet animates at the object level. Oh well, actually, yeah. Let me demonstrate this, because what's interesting is, so I have these framed animations moving along here. Let me go back to Grease Pencil, turn off the onion skinning, and let's say I want to animate my object. What's interesting is now I'm animating this thing at 2 levels. Sorry, I was in draw mode on the stroke, so let me get out of draw mode, go back to object mode. So now the strokes are drawing because I've drawn these strokes in different places for the associated frames. But now I could actually move the entire stroke object at a higher level. So I'll go into Dope Sheet, and then I know I have a key where it sets it here, but maybe here I want to grab the stroke, and let's just make it move up a little bit. So I think that's Z, and I'm going to hit uh, I location. So now that's recorded my location, the new location data. So the grease pencil animation is still happening, but so is the object, like the parent of the whole thing. So that can be really confusing at first, and I'm hoping this helps kind of demonstrate the difference of how you have two different modes. So let me hide this, go back to this picture. So now we can kind of see, I'm going to hide the cube. So now we can see how the cube, we can really just move it or animate it in object. But for Grease Pencil, you can actually animate the whole object, which was it moving up. And you could also animate individually inside of frames that move along with the whole object. So now what we're going to talk about is actually the time has come. We're going to get into the practical example. So you have all the information you need at this moment technically, but it's going to all come home once you see a practical application and how it's going to be used. So let's go do that. So now what we're going to do is a bouncing ball. So we are going to be drawing this bouncing ball. I'm not going to do exactly like this, and we're also only going to do one arc, and then we're going to loop it and animate the object so that it gives the illusion of moving across the screen. So this is, I think this is from Richard Williams, I think his name is, his book on animation. He worked on Roger Rabbit, and he talks about the principles of animation. Um, Arcs are an important principle, conservation of volume, silhouettes, um, spacing, timing, squash and stretch. These are all principles that you should get familiar with. They're guidelines. They're not hard set rules. Anyhow, this is what we're going to be making. So let's go to Blender. This is a brand new 2D animation scene. So first thing I want to do is I like to frame up my scene so I can see the frame. I'm going to use my middle mouse button to scroll, kind of bring it back here a little bit. I'm going to bring this up here so I can see my animation information. I'm going to rename my strokes. It's a simple scene, but it's just a good habit to get into. Name the stuff in your scene so that you can organize, and once your scenes get more complex, you might have multiple stroke objects and it'll be easy to figure out what's what. Okay, so next thing, I'm going to look at my layers. So I have lines and fills. I'm actually going to create a new layer. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to add a layer. I'm going to call this guy background. I'm going to use this to draw in some reference lines to help guide my animation. So now let's just move it down all the way to the back. Looks good. So my layers are good. Let's look at my palette. How's my palette? So I've got a solid black line, sure. Red line, I'm not going to use this. I'm just going to remove it. Solid gray fill, okay. This dots I'm not going to use, so I'm going to remove it. I don't think I need to create anything else. I'll just be doing black outlines with gray fills for the bouncing ball. All right, so first off, I want to lay in some reference lines. So I'm going to be in this background. I'm going to select, well, first let's make sure I have the right brush selected. Also, I'm in draw mode. So let's go and just create a line so that I have a reference ground plane. And that did not render well. Oh, because I have the wrong material selected. So I'm going to Control Z. So yeah, with the material I had selected, a line has no concept of how it's supposed to do a fill. So let me just delete that. So I'm going to select the solid color here. Now I'll draw the line. If I hold shift, it just stays straight. And then I'll hit enter. That looks good to me. Next off, I want to have a reference for the arc just to make sure it looks good. So let's say we start here and maybe end over here and just kind of bring it up a little bit. So this will be the arc of our animation. So I'll hit enter. So now I've got these two references. I'm going to lock the layer and let's start drawing the bouncing ball. So I'm going to hold shift middle mouse button, scroll wheel to zoom in, shift middle mouse button to pan, scroll wheel to zoom in, and now I'm in the right layer. I have the right ink and my pencil. I don't want a pencil, I want to use this. I want to get the correct brush. All right, so we're going to start with a squash ball. Whoops, I'm still in the arc tool. So let me undo that, Control Z, go back to the drawing tool, and let me expand these out a little so we can see their names. So going back to the draw tool, I've got my ink. So let's just draw. Okay, that's not great. Let's do it. I'm gonna Control Z, just kind of get a little loose here. Control Z until I get something that I can roughly work with. I'm not gonna make it perfect. That's good enough. All right. Next up, we are going to be kind of bouncing away. So we're going to elongate, be roughly the same size. Shift middle mouse button to pan around. And then here we're going to be kind of further along on the top of the arc, but maybe starting to round out a little bit more. And then here we're getting even closer. So we're going to almost be back at our full size. Here we're at the top of the arc. We don't have any squash or anything because we're kind of at a neutral position. Now we're going to start squashing. Let's just actually draw it similar to this one. You know what? I'm going to go into edit mode, and I am going to go to this frame. I'm going to select this guy, control copy, stay in edit mode, and then control paste, and then G to grab, and just move him over here. Make my life a little easier. And then control T, go back into draw mode, and we can kind of see what's going on. So we're moving along, and oh, that's what I wanted to mention, this onion skinning. So onion skinning is pretty helpful. You toggle it here with this button. You could also do it over here. You can also say how many frames you want to show in onion skinning before and after by simply going to the stroke properties, scroll down, you see onion skinning. So I could say, show me up to like even 10 frames before and or 8 frames before and 8 frames after. So then that way I could get a sense of how the animation's coming along. Another important note about onion skinning is if you're in rendered mode, you're not going to see it. So it's going to be really frustrating because you're going to be hitting this like, what's going on? And it's just because you're in the wrong shading mode. You want to be either in material preview or solid in order to be able to see the onion skinning. All right, so we're coming along. And what do we want to do next? I could probably just copy this guy. You know, I can draw that again. That's not that hard. All right. So now we're elongating. Gravity is starting to pull us down. And then we're moving a little faster, so our spacing is going to increase, or the distance between the drawings is going to increase. That's our spacing. Creates speed. And then we're going to have very quickly next to it a contact, and then back to our squashed. So now I'm going to trim my timeline here, but just click and drag so that when I hit play, it doesn't go all the way up to 250. It just loops on what I've done. So then here's our animation so far. This is the bouncing ball. So now we're going to go into other tools that we can use to kind of clean up and work with this. So first of all, gonna control middle mouse button to get in a little bit, and then shift middle mouse button to look at this a little bit better. So I want to go into sculpt mode on this guy because I want to fix. So I'm going to hit F, make my radius bigger, and just Control Z this, hit F, make it a little bit bigger. Shift F to check the strength. So I'm at maximum strength. That's what I want. All right, so now I just want to just improve this shape a little bit on this guy. And hold Shift to smooth it out. And Shift. So holding Shift smooths it out, and I'm using the grab tool. Oh, it's the push. That's why it wasn't really behaving the way I wanted. So back to F and grab tool. I find works a little bit better for me. Anyhow, you get the idea. I'm not going to make this perfect. I just want to show the different tools and how you would use them to kind of refine your work. So now let's go up a frame to this guy and let's help him out. So let's just smooth this. I'm going to trim this guy by going back to draw mode and using the cutter and cut here. Okay. That just cuts overlapping stroke. So let's go back, Shift Tab to sculpt, sorry. And we want to make it look like it's kind of the same ball so it doesn't lose too much volume. And we want the center mass to be moving along the arc. So let's bring it kind of back this way. Shift to smooth. Shift to smooth. Looks good to me. And now let's go up. And let's just make this guy look a little bit better. Shift smooth. Looks good to me. Shift middle mouse button. Let's progress to the next frame. And it feels like it lost a lot of volume. So let's give it some volume and still make it just a little bit of elongation. Shift to smooth. Move that out a little bit. You could also play with thickness, so I could make that a little thicker. Let me reduce the strength because it's just coming on way too strong. So let me do that. Okay, that feels a little better. So back to grab, and there's this guy here. Shift move, and let's go to our next frame. And bring in the grab tool. That's good. Let's just make him a little more rounded. Looks good to me. Go over to the next frame. Shift smooth just to kind of get the lumpiness out of him. Then make him round and somewhat elongated. Shift middle mouse button to pan. Go to 47. Make this guy feel like it's the same volume as the rest of them. Gonna actually zoom back a little just to double check. Good enough. Here we are. Should be at our most elongated, so it's narrower and longer. And then finally we have our contact, which is pretty narrow and long. It's just before it squashes, so that'll help it really get that squash sensation. And the squash, this guy, they look a little different. I'm gonna hit F to reduce the brush size a little. And shift to smooth. And I'm gonna increase my onion skinning because I can't actually see this frame. It's more than 8. So now I can see it. And I'll say it's good enough. So now when we hit play, the first thing I notice is that the timing feels off. So I can see here that it is about 25 frames per second, so it should feel real time-ish, off by 1 frame. So now let's work on the timing. So the timing is when things happen. I'm going to control middle mouse button to zoom in, shift middle mouse button to pan, and just kind of rinse and repeat to see the timing a little bit better. So now the time it takes to, I think that generally all the timing is too slow. So I'm going to select these and I'm going to hit S to scale. Then I just want to watch them, make sure they don't completely overlap each other, because then I might lose some information. So I want this to be a little bit closer to this, and then as it's speeding up, and then it's going to kind of really slow down here at the arc, and then this should happen faster, this should happen faster, and then this should happen even faster. So less space between them means it's happening faster into the hit. So I'm going to reduce this to here and hit play. It's a little better, but it still feels slow. So I'm just going to grab them all again and hit S to scale them all down. Oh, the scaling happens relative to where I'm at. So let me bring this back here so that the scale happens relative to that. Hit S and just scale them in a lot more. All right. And there we have the bouncing ball. So if I just hide my reference plane, and there it is. There's the bouncing ball. So up next, what we're going to do is figure out how to loop the animation and then offset it. So we've got our animation, and now we want it to loop. I'm just going to turn the onion skinning off, and we want it to loop. It still feels slow. Let me scale this a little. Let me just adjust the timing, just narrow the space between everything a little bit more. And then trim and spacebar. All right, it's feeling a little better now. Timing's improved. So now we're going to make it loop. And the way we make it loop is we're going to use a modifier. The modifier we're going to add is the time offset modifier. And we're going to say custom range. And what I want you to loop is between 1 and I'm going to make it 22. So that means that when it hits the end of the loop, it's going to come back here, which is where we should be looping basically. So I'm going to make this 22, hit enter, because the last frame is, the first frame is the same as the last frame in a loop. So now if I extend my timeline, it should loop beyond. So let's see. I've got regular time offset, frame 1 to 22, custom range is selected. And let's go into object mode, zoom a little bit, whoops, hit 0 to get back into the camera, shift middle mouse button here. So now we see that it's zooming, or sorry, looping. So it's looping. So, but in order to get the real effect that we want, we have to kind of have it progress, right? So the way we can do that is by animating it at the object level. And just one little nuance thing that got me stuck when I used this time offset modifier. You'll notice that when I was in draw mode, let's see, and I have the ball selected. Oh no, it works. But sometimes as soon as I applied it, it wouldn't be looping here. I'd actually have to go out into object mode to make it really loop. So if you ever get stuck, you put the modifier, you hit custom, and you set the frames of the grease pencil drawings that you want to loop, and it's not looping out of the range of the frames. Just change your mode, go out into object, and then come back in. All right. So now we're in object, so we're not working with grease pencil frames where we're drawing strokes. So we want to use the dope sheet now to animate our stroke object. So we want it to start here. So we're going to hit the letter I, hit the letter L, and then when we get to okay, so I goofed. I should set the time offset to 23 to make sure that it comes all the way and makes the contact. Oh no, I think what I can do is at 21, um, no, at 22, I'm going to grab and move the ball in X to where I think it should be. I'm going to hit I and location. So now here's a little trick. What I want is for this position to just hold. I don't want it to actually interpolate between here and the target position I made. So I want it to hold for this whole time. So the way we do that is by playing with tangents. So if we go to the graph editor, we can actually see our animation curves. And then here I see how it's moving in the X direction, my object, right? So if I grab this guy here, can play with the handle type, and then I can set it to, actually I want to play with the handle type here at the beginning. So I go to handle type, and I want to make it interpolation mode constant. That's what I want. So now you see there's no gradual changing of the X values. It's just going to hold, pop, change, right? So now it's going to stay where it was up until here, then it pops and changes, and now it goes to the next bounce. So now we have effectively that bouncing animation. So that's why I needed to come into the graph editor. You could also set your tangents in the dope sheet. I just wanted to show you because seeing the actual curve before it was this spline that was gradually changing, but now you see that it's just holding, and I can expand here, and we're just really playing with our X location, and just had a right click and interpolation mode constant so that it held. So now let's go back to our dope sheet. And now here it's even showing us visually that it's holding. This green line wasn't here before. It's saying this animation is actually holding up until the new one. So we do this. And let's do this one the other way. So the next one we want is probably around here. And then I'm just going to grab the object, move it in X to where I think the contact point would be there. I could hit I, L for location. And again, it's going to do the smooth interpolation. So the object is moving. You could tell when the object is moving by looking at that red point. So the object is moving. Here it's constant. The object is not moving because I made it constant interpolation. So now let's just change that up again. Let's right click interpolation mode constant. And now it shows us that it's not going to move and it's going to get to this frame. So I'm going to hit spacebar. And there we go. We've got our bouncing ball. Let's trim the timeline to here. And there we go. We've made our animation. I do think it is. It's not perfect, but I don't want to make this video too long. So it's good enough for you to get the idea of how we worked with grease pencil. Let me select the object to create frames, to make drawings. We used the sculpting tool. We used editing to copy and generally place things. And then we use sculpt mode to refine the line and draw mode to create the lines. So that's really like the main points that we're focusing on. And then we worked in the dope sheet to actually animate at an object level. So we're transforming this whole thing. We changed our interpolation type here in order to have it hold, and then snap to this new location. Or you can see the snap if you're looking at this orange dot, right? So it just snaps from one frame to the next. So here we're at the end of the animation, but then we move the whole object over. So when it loops back, we're back at the beginning of the animation, and we just have to make those points match. They don't match perfectly. It looks kind of like it hits here, and then it flops down, and that really robs it of some momentum visually. It kind of stutters back for a moment. But I'm not going to take too much time refining the animation. So so now we've done that. We've also learned how to use time offset to loop our frames in Grease Pencil independently of our full scene timeline. And again, this is all happening here in 3D space. If we hit play, we can see we've got our bouncing ball moving around. So so that's the bouncing ball. Hope you found that useful. And now we're going to create another shot. So now we've learned how to create basically one shot. This is our character. We've got our camera and it's working. But now let's say we wanted to cut to another shot that's showing the ball bouncing towards us. That's what we're going to be working on next. Actually, before we get into creating a new scene and how to cut scenes together inside of the same Blender file, which is actually really cool, let's. I forgot to show you how to use the fill tool in the context of this demo. So let's select the object. Now what we want to do is be in our fill layer. We can lock our lines layer since we don't really want to be messing with it. We don't necessarily need the onion skinning. So to use the fill tool, first of all, Control Tab to get into draw mode. Select the fill tool. Very important part is just to make sure you have something, a stroke that's set to type fill. So let me middle mouse and then shift middle mouse to bring us up here. So now now that I'm in the right layer, I'm in the frame I want to be in, I simply click and it fills the ball. Move over here next. So it's pretty straightforward to do the fill. And then once we're done, I'm actually going to show you how to use some effects really quickly. All right, so we are all filled up. So now when we play the animation, we have this solid object. So here are some really cool effects that you can use with Grease Pencil. You apply the effects by going to the effect property of the Grease Pencil object. The first one we're going to do, let's do shadow. So now we're going to create a shadow. We can't see it yet because unlike onion skinning, you need to be in a different mode. So now we want to be in rendered mode, and you see this slightly offset thing. So I'm going to bring it. Okay, that'll bring it back. I actually want to bring it down. Let's go back to frame one and let's have the shadow. I'm just clicking and dragging, and then I want to kind of squash it. Whoops. squash it. So the scaling is happening relative to the point, and I want to bring it down here. So now I've got this contact shadow, and I guess the the stroke that I had selected is determining the color. Let me see. Okay, so this sets it up as if though the light source were, somewhere over here, up here, and it's casting the shadow. So now we have a shadow in our object. We can zoom back, and that's all for free. So we quickly have a nice shadow we can use. And then let's do another effect. So let's collapse the shadow. Now let's do a rim. So now you see that it created this rim light. We can play around with where it is, whether it's coming from the top or the bottom. Let's say it's coming from the top like that. Now when we animate it, we've got a rim light, we've got a shadow, all for free, pretty quick and easy. So that's what I wanted to cover for this part here, was just that the filling, how to use the fill tool, how to create the shadow with the effects, and how to create the rim light. Now we're going to look at creating a new scene and basically drawing the ball kind of coming towards us as if though the camera came from like a kind of a wide shot to kind of a closer shot looking at the ball. And then we're going to cut those scenes together, render, and we're all done. And I hope you feel uh, comfortable with using grease pencils. All right, so I've been working on this demo for creating multiple scenes. I've done it several times now because Blender is crashing on me. Sad face. So, just for full disclosure, this is my GPU. I checked the forums, and they do say that Blender is a little crashy for this GPU. So if you don't have this GPU, it might not even be an issue for you. Could be the drivers, could be Blender, who knows. So anyhow, back to the tutorial. So this is where Blender does its scene management, and what we can do now is just create a new scene. So if I were to create a new scene, you'll see it's completely blank. But what I actually want to do is make a copy. So I'm going to do full copy. Now it looks like I have two scenes that are identical, because actually that is what it is. So let me rename the first scene. And let's rename the second scene. You guessed it, Ball 02. All right. So now here we have our two scenes. So let's change some things. I'm going to be deleting some information here. So here we see we have animation data on our object. We could also see it here in the dope sheet. Again, the orange dot showing that our object is in fact moving. So let's kill that. Clear animation data. So now we're not moving. We're not progressing anymore because the object is not translating in the scene. Next, let's kill these effects. And next, let's kill this modifier. So now we're just back at our original drawing. No looping, no fanciness. All right. So now let's clean up the grease pencil. Let's clear it out so we can do our new drawings. So I'm going to unlock these layers, select the frames, delete keyframes. So now it's a brand new stroke object that I'm going to use to draw. So make sure I'm in the right layer, make sure I've got the right ink, aka material, make sure I go into the right mode to draw. And so it's having error going into mode. I saw that before, so it's starting to get a little buggy. Fingers crossed we don't crash. So I'm going to edit mode, went in there smoothly. Now I think I can go into draw mode. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go to draw, and I'm going to start drawing. So first ball here, second one here, it's getting closer. And let's just say third one here, it's super close. And I want to close this line for the fill tool to work. Okay, so now let's go ahead and fill it. Select the solid ink, go to the fills layer, select the fill tool, and fill, and fill, and fill. Okay. So back into object mode. All right, so now we have these two scenes. So if I come over here, we have the ball going off screen, and over here to O2, we have the ball kind of coming towards us. So now in order to cut these together, we're going to have to create a third scene. We can call it Final Cut, for example. So this one we will do new. We don't need to copy the information over. We'll call it Final Cut. And we're going to switch our UI mode. We're going to go into video editing. So if you don't see that, maybe if you hit the plus, you'll see video editing. And that's where we want to go. So to add the sequences, it's like when you add something into the 3D scene, you do Shift A. Well, you do Shift A here, and we're going to be adding our scenes. So there, we've added our first scene. There we are. And then we want to Shift A, add our second scene. And there we are. So now we can effectively edit a more complicated sequence with multiple shots in the same Blender file. So the advantage of this is I can come back here, let's say, for example, and let's say I want to actually draw it a little bit closer, so I can go back to this scene, go back into 2D animation UI layout, and come over here where I want the new drawing. We are in draw mode. We shall draw. We shall select you. Select the right ink, and then we'll draw this guy here. Oops, I was in the fill layer. Let me go back into lines. And then we'll go into fill, pick the solid color, fill. All right, then we can go back to our Final Cut, and again, back into video editing, and we zoom the timeline out here. Navigating this timeline is similar to the scene. It's kind of all middle mouse button click centric. So if I just click and hold the middle mouse button, I could pan. Scroll wheel brings me out a little bit, and shift and click, and then I can move it around this way. You could also use this for resizing it as well. But now you see that the change I just did shows up. So that means you have this kind of iterative workflow for the shots, and you can also be working on cutting your sequence of shots together. And then finally, we can go into rendering. So when we want to render, we have our scene properties here, as always. We'll set our render. Eve is a real-time render. It's pretty fast. We could reduce our samples. Let's just say 16, so it goes by pretty quick when we pull the trigger. There's a bunch of options I'm not going to get into because this video is already very long. I just want to give you the basic notions, and then you can explore on your own. Here we set up our output properties, so our resolution, percentage. We can reduce it if our renders take too long and we're just trying to maybe just see it, and we're not too concerned that it's super high quality. We're more concerned that it renders quickly. We can reduce the percentage of our renders. And then we set our start and end frame. You could also set those right here. So our current frame is 89. Let's just set it to 90. And then what else we got? Frame rate 24 frames per second. output, it's gonna just default to where this file is. So that's where it's going to render to. And then we can set it to, for example, uh, FFmpeg video, which will allow me to make it H.264, set the quality. So now everything is pretty much set up for the render. And now I can just go to render animation. Let me scroll so we can see a little bit better. And there we go. So it rendered pretty quick because it's Eve. So I didn't speed that up or anything. I'm too lazy to do that. But let me show you the final result once I find the project folder. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, so it made it this MKV type. I'll show you how to change that here in a second. But anyway, here you see the animation. So this is how you would render your animation. So now you have a sense of the workflow A to Z for Grease Pencil using Blender. So if you wanted to um, make it an MPEG-4 or a QuickTime AVI, you could change that here. One thing to look out for when you're working with the video editor is that, let's say for example you go back to one of your scenes, you go into 2D animation mode and you change some information, you draw something new, whatever, and then you come back to your cut scene and you go into video editing mode, of course, and then you scrub through or you play through and you don't see the changes that you've just made in the scene. If you notice this red line down here, this means that Blender has cached the frames. So in order to clear the cache, you hit Control R, and now it'll force Blender to reevaluate the scene. So you should see your changes now. So it doesn't happen all the times, but if you do find yourself in that situation, now you know Control R, just clear the cache, and then you'll be good to go. So this concludes the tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found it useful. I certainly found it a lot of fun to make. I learned a lot in this whole process. So you are now Grease Pencil Yellow Belt. So go forth and be inspired, make fun stuff. I hope to see it. And again, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next tutorials coming down the pipeline.